Hi, this is Robert Maire from Semiconductor Advisors. We're happy to be back at ASMC, even if virtually. We're going to reprise one of the topics we've spoken about before, which garnered some great interest in the audience, and that is China. And our topic today is, will China take the semiconductor industry lead from the US? And as a secondary topic, is Intel going fab light, the beginning of the end of the US semiconductor industry? There are lots of moving parts and players in today's drama. Obviously, technology, politics, global domination, and of course, money. China has an effort called Made in China 2025, and they're spending over $100 billion to get to that point of building their own semiconductors. In parallel, we've seen that Intel has really fallen on its own sword with its second technology delay, now at 7 nanometers, after having a significant delay at 10 nanometers. In addition to that, TSMC and Taiwan are a short boat ride away from reunification with China, who has promised to reunify Taiwan, much like it has Hong Kong. We think that's obviously a very timely and critical political issue that's going on, and we only see that issue as getting worse over time. Another topic is, are semiconductors following what we've seen in other industries? We've seen many other industries, from the steel industry to others, move overseas. Is this just a factor of being a more mature industry moving to China? Huawei was obviously a wake-up call to arms in China's road to self-determination. This was certainly something that has concerned them, has become a huge contention point with China and the US, and is certainly in the news of late. And this has only accelerated China's demands to get to its own self-sufficient semiconductor industry. The next topic is, dominate chips and you dominate the defense and technology and intelligence industries. And obviously that goes hand in hand with global domination. One of the reasons the US is so dominant is because of our technology, and that's obviously grounded in the semiconductor industry. So if China becomes very dominant in semiconductors, what does that mean for global military and intelligence domination? Also, recently there's been a piece of legislation that's been pending called Chips for America, which is looking to spend $22 billion to help the US semiconductor industry. In addition to this, there's been pressure for TSMC to bring fabs to the US, and as part of that, they've proposed building a 5 nanometer fab in Arizona. The next topic is talking about semiconductor equipment, one of my favorite topics. And we continue to sell semiconductor equipment, that is Applied Materials, KLA, and Lam, I think everybody but ASML. And there don't seem to be any restrictions or other issues with us selling this technology to China, even though we've been talking about those restrictions. And the final topic is, will chip design follow chip manufacture to China? So far, companies like Qualcomm, Broadcom, others in the industry still maintain control of the design of the semiconductors, even though they're made at TSMC. But do we see the design following manufacture to China and to Asia? So let's talk about Made in China 2025. Importantly, China has both the funding and the political willpower to get that done. China currently consumes about 60% of the worldwide production of semiconductors, but only manufactures 15%, and they obviously want to close that gap. The US cutting off Huawei only accelerates their desire to dominate the semiconductor industry. Importantly, the Chinese government and industry are both aligned, which is unlike the case in the US, where the industry and the government seem to be going in different directions. The Chinese certainly don't seem to care quite as much as to how they obtain the technology, as we've seen in the case of Jinhua. Technology was blatantly stolen from Micron, and whatever can't be bought or stolen can perhaps be copied. They have over $150 billion right now that's out there earmarked for the semiconductor industry. There are those who say it might even be more than that. And this is not just buying semiconductor equipment and building fabs. This is buying companies, buying IP, and all the infrastructure that goes with the semiconductor industry. Right now, China is the biggest spender on semiconductor equipment today. If you listen to the quarterly conference calls from Applied Materials, from KLA, Lam Research, and the industry, by far, all of them say that China is their largest market for semiconductor equipment and continues to be, and we seem to continue to sell equipment on an unrestricted basis. The U.S. has talked about, but has failed to implement any true restrictions on technology sales. Years ago, we did have such restrictions, but right now those restrictions are no longer in force. So let's talk about Intel for a moment. Intel obviously stumbled here and now has what looks like minimum a 6-month and perhaps even a year delay in 7 nanometers. TSMC, on the other hand, has been virtually relentless. They have had no delays. They've continued to move forward in technology without a single hiccup. And we've also seen other companies like SMIC in China continuing to spend rather aggressively. Intel, on its last conference call, talked about going to a fab-light hybrid model using TSMC, which means they'll use their own internal fabs for some production and use TSMC for others, and perhaps do this with chiplet technology and combine different chiplets of different technology nodes on one interposer. Right now, it's probably the only solution that's going to satisfy customers and keep up with Moore's Law, taking advantage of TSMC's ability plus Intel's ability in being able to glue those chips together seems to be their only alternative. It looks like the 10 and 7 nanometer slips are not recoverable. They did try to push ahead on 7 nanometers only to fall down again. It's quite unfortunate. Apple obviously figured out that Intel was having problems and was delayed and went their own way, designing their own processors with TSMC to be put into their product. So far, TSMC has had near perfect execution in this and continues, so it's going to be really hard to catch TSMC unless they trip up, and we don't see that happening in the near term. SMIC and domestic Chinese fab are on what we would call a catch-up spending spree, meaning they're spending more than just the amount of money required to keep them in the race. They're spending what we would view as catch-up mode or get-ahead mode. Intel and AMD, in our view, will look much similar over time, much more competitive. They'll be buying their devices from the same TSMC, and obviously that means potentially lower value for Intel, as now, rather than having their own manufacturing, which has always been their key in the industry, they really are competing against AMD on a design basis and less so on a manufacturing basis. Intel isn't the only one who's having issues. Samsung is also behind TSMC and continues to have trouble keeping up. So let's talk about TSMC and China and Taiwan and what that all means. As we've said, we think it's not a question of if, but a question of when Taiwan will become part of China again. Does that happen in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years? It's kind of hard to say, but clearly with what's going on in Hong Kong and what's going on with the South China Sea, we think the odds of China being more aggressive against Taiwan as increasing over time. And we wonder sometimes what the United States would do about it. We look to Russia's takeover of Crimea as a prime example of what won't happen. In Russia's takeover of Crimea, they took over a country which was right on their border, spoke the same language, much as with Taiwan and China, and the U.S. didn't do anything, unfortunately. We see China's growing influence around the world, not only in the South China Sea, but we see it in Africa, we see it in South America. Clearly, they're looking to do more, and we think getting a hold of Taiwan would certainly be a huge prize for them. Getting TSMC would mean they would get instant dominance in the semiconductor industry. We think that China may view that TSMC as a prize worthy of the risk of getting into a military conflict with the United States. And last but not least, we think the actions we've seen in Hong Kong are really a good predictor of what we may see going on in Taiwan. So are semiconductors just following other industries that have already moved to China? Is this just part of what a maturing industry looks like? We've already seen steel, pharmaceuticals. It was interesting to find out during the COVID crisis that 90% of our pharmaceuticals are already made in China, which gets us to the point of what isn't made in China today. Everything we seem to buy is made in China. Look what happened to the solar and LED industries, which are obviously close cousins to the semiconductor industry. And we saw the help that the Chinese government provided in setting up those factories in China, in supporting the takeover of the solar and the LED industries. In pharmaceuticals, as I mentioned, the U.S. no longer produces much of its own drugs, China doing 90%. The steel industry, it was interesting to note that Tesla's first factory outside of the United States was in China, not in Europe or anywhere else. Also, the issue of rare earth elements and China's domination of the rare earth elements that are required and used in semiconductors, those are all primarily sourced in China. All the mines and other sources of rare earth elements in the United States have been closed down and really don't exist anymore. Obviously, if China dominates both the semiconductor industry, pharmaceutical industry, they're going to have a lot more leverage over us. And we think we'll see that as a strategic imperative on their part over time. So let's talk about Huawei. Huawei's been in the news. ZTE, to some extent, was a warm-up for Huawei. I think that cutting off Huawei demonstrated to China the U.S.'s resolve in trying to use that as a lever against China, which only doubled down China's goal of becoming semiconductor independent. Jinhua, which is now $1 billion hole in the ground, only amplifies that. Obviously, China's not happy about having Jinhua shut down, and again, we'll look for sources of technology internally. We see that it's not just semiconductors, TikTok, other software companies that people are concerned about theft of information, theft of intellectual property. Recently, the U.S. has threatened to cut China off from the dollar payment system, much as we cut Iran off, and that would be a monstrously large move, which would be very significant in the industry. So far, China really hasn't used its leverage in return. It does have leverage. It could cut us off from rare earth, but the U.S. has used its leverage in cutting off Huawei and Jinhua and ZTE. So it's rather interesting. China hasn't really responded quite as much as of yet. We view this as not that much different from a nuclear arms race where the U.S. has had leverage and other players such as the Soviet Union and China and the rest really had to develop the bomb, if only to keep up with the United States and prevent the United States from getting leverage against them. Basically, China doesn't want to be subservient in the nuclear arms race, nor subservient in semiconductor technology, which could be almost as important. Related to that, semiconductors are obviously key to both military and intelligence dominance. The U.S. military dominance is in large part due to our advanced weaponry and communications, all driven by the semiconductor industry. Intelligence gathering no longer depends as much upon human assets as technology assets, drones, satellite, image and voice recognition, AI, encryption technology, etc. Again, highly dependent on the semiconductor industry. In China, they have perhaps the largest population monitoring and control using millions and millions of cameras and facial recognition to track their population and control the population. So it's not just external control of politics, it's internal control of politics as well. If China wants to be more than just a manufacturing economy and turn into an information economy. The access to semiconductors and therefore servers and processors and other attributes of an information-based economy all require large semiconductor support. China has a goal of passing the U.S. in global domination, and dominating semiconductors is a key ingredient for them being more dominant across the globe. They certainly now have the money, they have the political will, so this is another portion of China's plan to become substantially more dominant on a global basis. So let's talk about chips for America. We think it's a small start, kind of a little bit of a rounding error, not a complete solution, but it's certainly better than nothing. $22 billion, which looks like the scope of the project for several years, is less than what China is spending on semiconductor equipment in 1 year alone. The proposed TSMC fab in Arizona is a little too little, a little too late. It's talked about as a 5 nanometer fab with 20,000 wafer starts. By the time it gets built, we'll probably be down below 3 nanometers, and it'll be not trailing edge technology, but certainly not leading edge. And 20,000 wafer starts is barely a drop in the bucket. With the Intel delay, now I think Intel, rather than being neck and neck with TSMC, is clearly behind TSMC in Moore's Law. Global Foundries obviously is frozen in place, stuck in time at 14 nanometers. So we really don't have a foundry or an IDM that's up to speed in the US anymore, or will be behind relatively shortly. Unlike the US, the Chinese government is very deeply involved in funding semiconductor projects, either directly or indirectly. This $22 billion is the first time that the U.S. government has talked about helping out the semiconductor industry. We certainly hope that the number goes up from there and they realize exactly what it will cost to keep the U.S. competitive in the semiconductor industry. Along with money, there are environmental issues and other issues that have pushed manufacturing overseas, and we would hope that a lot of these other non-financial issues that have hurt our competitiveness get addressed. We think we should see financial incentives coupled with disincentives and directives by the U.S. government of how and where semiconductors are made, and try other actions aside from just monetary injection. There should be infrastructure changes that incentivize people to manufacture semiconductors in the U.S. We've even seen that Intel, while it was planning to increase its outsourcing to TSMC, was talking about running the project to head U.S. revitalization in the semiconductor industry. And we thought that was rather interesting in that Intel was talking out of both sides of its mouth at the same time. One of the basic issues here is we need to enhance our workforce in the semiconductor industry. A lot of the workforce in the semiconductor industry is older. We don't see as much in the newer generation, which is more information-based and working for companies that use semiconductor products but don't produce semiconductor products. And education and basic R&D in the U.S. and the semiconductor industry need further improvement and need a bit of revitalization to keep the semiconductor industry relevant. We continue to sell China the rope that they're going to use to hang us. We continue to sell them semiconductor equipment unabated. There are more fab projects going on in China than the rest of the world combined. Years ago, when SMIC first turned on its fab in China, we had restrictions on sales of what technology could be exported from the U.S. To SMIC. Those laws still exist, but they're really not being enforced. As we see from the conference calls, all the companies are continuing to sell even the latest and greatest technology to China without restriction. The only company that seems to have been restricted is ASML, seems to be restricted in the sale of an EUV scanner to China. Well, even though Forced technology transfers may have technically been stopped. We still think that China looks to get technology transfers from companies that work there, and that remains an issue. Technology theft certainly remains rampant. Micron Jinhua was a prime example of that. UMC aided Jinhua in stealing that technology. There's, in our opinion, little difference between China domestic fabs and foreign-owned fabs. They both seem to be getting technology very easily. It's not just a question of semiconductor equipment companies shipping to Samsung or Intel fabs located in China. It's both China domestic fabs as well as foreign-owned fabs that are getting the equipment. We think if the U.S. stops selling equipment, what happens to Japan, Korea, and Dutch equipment companies? We think those restrictions need to be coordinated on a global basis. So one of our questions is, we've seen that chip manufacturing has moved to Taiwan and continues to move to China, but we've maintained a lot of the design technology in the U.S. Obviously AMD, Intel, Qualcomm, and the rest are in the U.S. But we've already seen a lot of significant design capabilities. HiSilicon, which is a subsidiary of Huawei, clearly has some pretty strong design capabilities. EDA companies appear to be selling unrestricted, on an unrestricted basis, EDA tools in China. In our view, EDA tools and design libraries and all that are even easier to steal or copy than semiconductor equipment tools, which are obviously hardware-based and more difficult to copy or obtain. And we also think that that EDA tools and design expertise is probably easy to, I shouldn't say fully easy, but faster to organically develop, even if you don't copy them. Existing design libraries make development of semiconductor designs much faster and much easier than in the past. So we think in terms of the design part of the industry, that will likely develop in China quite quickly. In our summary here, so we think that the loss of the semiconductor industry can certainly be prevented or slowed. I think that reversing the loss might be a little bit more difficult, if not impossible. It's kind of like getting toothpaste back in the tube. Once it's gone, it's going to be difficult to recover. Clearly, Taiwan and TSMC have not stumbled. It's not likely that China is going to slow down its efforts here. Investing more heavily now on the part of the U.S. government and the industry could help prevent some future losses of technology. I think maintaining our dominance now could actually help prevent further conflicts with China. If China becomes emboldened, the conflicts on this side may get worse, not better. We need help for not only the logic industry and Intel, but for foundry. Clearly, GloFo is not up to par in the foundry industry, and Micron is a relatively small percentage of the memory industry. So it's not just foundry, not just logic, it's across the industry. We need to support the semiconductor industry. The U.S. really needs to decide on what its priorities are. Is its priorities profit and shipping manufacturing overseas, or do we want to have security for our country and leadership in the industry? The industry can't do it alone. We need more than token incentives and more than small expenditures of money or trailing edge fabs. The semiconductor industry, in our view, could be more important than oil or steel or pharmaceuticals and other industries which have already been lost to China. And this could prove to be, one of the final industries that China needs in order to be even more dominant in the industry than they are today. We hope you've enjoyed listening to us. We've enjoyed presenting this. We're happy to answer any questions that you want to email to us. Our email address is rmaire at semiconductoradvisors.com. You can also look us up on our website, semiconductoradvisors.com. Thank you very much for listening.